Now, the newspaper reporter, from the nature of the case, has generally to deal with the commonplaces of life. I mean, he does his best to find something singular and arresting in the spectacle of the day's doings, but in spite of himself, he's generally forced to confess that whatever there may be beneath the surface itself is rather dull. I must allow, however, that during my 10 years or so in Fleet Street, I did come across some tracks that were not altogether devoid of oddity. There was that business of Campo Tosto, for example, that never got into the papers. Campo Tosto, I must explain, was a person. He was a Belgian gentleman settled for many years in England who had left all his property to the man who looked after him. My news editor was struck by something odd in the brief story that had appeared in the morning paper, and he sent me down to make inquiries. I left the train at Reigate, and there I found that Mr. Campo Tosto had lived at a place called Burnt Green, which is a translation of his name into English, and that he shot at trespassers with a bow and arrows. Now, I was driven to his house, and I saw through a glass door some of the property which he had bequeathed to his servant, 15th century triptychs, carved statues of the saints, great spiked altar candlesticks, and a good deal more old church treasures. The legatee, whose name was Turk, would not let me enter, but as a treat, he took my newspaper from my pocket and read it upside down with the greatest accuracy and facility. Now, I wrote this very queer story up, but Fleet Street would not suffer it. No, I believe it struck them as too strange a thing for their sober columns. And then there was the affair of the JHVS syndicate, which dealt with a Kabbalistic cipher and the phenomenon called in the Old Testament the glory of the Lord, and the discovery of certain objects buried under the site of the temple at Jerusalem. Now, that story was left half told, and I never heard the ending of it. And again, I never understood the affair of the hoard of coins disclosed by a storm on the Suffolk coast near Aldborough. From the talk of the longshoremen who are on the lookout among the dunes, it appeared that a great wave had come in and washed away a slice of the sand cliff just beneath them. They saw glittering objects as the sea washed aback, and they retrieved what they could of a large collection of coins. Now, I viewed this treasure myself. The earliest coin was of the 12th century. The latest were 3 or 4 pennies of Edward VII and a bronze medal of Charles Spurgeon. I mean, there are, of course, explanations of the puzzle, but there are difficulties in the way of accepting any one of them, I think. I mean, it's very clear, for example, that the hoard was not gathered by a collector of coins. I mean, neither the 20th century pennies nor the medal of the great Baptist preacher would appeal to any self-respecting numismatologist. But perhaps the queerest story to which my newspaper connections introduced me was the affair of the Reverend Secretan Jones, the Cannonbury clergyman, as the headlines called him. I mean, to begin with, it was a matter of a sudden disappearance. Now, I believe that all sorts of people disappear by dozens in the course of every year, and nobody hears of them or their vanishings. I mean, perhaps they turn up again, perhaps they don't. Anyway, they never get so much as a line in the papers, and there's an end of it. But now and then there is some circumstance that draws attention to the fact that A or B was in his place on Monday and missing from it on Tuesday and Wednesday, and then inquiries are made, and usually the lost man is found, alive or dead, and the explanation is often simple enough. But as to the case of Secretan Jones, well, the gentleman was, as I've said, a cleric, but seldom, it appeared, exercising his sacred office. He lived retired in a misty square in the recesses of Cannonbury. He was understood to be engaged in some kind of scholarly research, and he was a well-known figure in the reading room of the British Museum. And it seems possible that if he had been content with that achievement, he might have disappeared as often as he pleased and no one would have noticed. But one night, As he sat late over his books in the stillness of Tollet Square, a motor lorry passing along a nearby road broke the silence with a heavy rumble and caused a tremor of the ground that penetrated into Secretan Jones's study. A teacup and a saucer on a side table trembled slightly, and the scholar's attention was momentarily taken from his authorities and his notebooks. Now, this was in the February of 1907, and the motor industry was still in its earliest stages. I mean, if you preferred a horse-drawn bus back then, there were still plenty of them left in the streets. Motor cars were virtually non-existent. Hansom cabs still jogged and jingled on in their cheerful way, and there were very few motor vans in use. But to Secretan Jones, disturbed by the rattle of his cup and saucer, a vision of the future had been vouchsafed, and he began to write to the newspapers. He foresaw the London streets almost as we know them today. Streets where a horse vehicle would be almost a matter to show one's children for them to remember in their old age. Streets in which a procession of vast omnibuses carrying 50, 70, 100 people were continually passing. Streets in which vans and trailers loaded far beyond the capacity of any manageable team of horses would make the ground tremble without ceasing. The retired clergyman, with the happy activity which does sometimes distinguish the fish out of water, went on, and he spared nothing. Newton saw the apple fall and built up a mathematical universe. Jones heard the teacup rattle and laid the universe of London in ruins. He pointed out that neither the roadways nor the houses beside them were constructed to withstand the weight and vibration of the coming traffic. He crumbled all the shops in Oxford Street and Piccadilly into dust. He cracked the dome of St. Paul's, brought down Westminster Abbey, reduced the law courts to a fine powder, and what was left was dealt with by fire, flood, and pestilence. You see, the prophetic Jones demonstrated that the roads must collapse upon the various services that lay beneath them. Here, the water mains and the main drainage would flood the streets. There, huge volumes of gas would escape and electric wires fuse. The earth would be rent with explosions, and the myriad streets of London would go up in a great flame of fire. I mean, nobody really believed that this would happen, of course, but it made good reading. And Secretan Jones gave interviews, started discussions, and for a while he enjoyed himself thoroughly. And that is how he became the Cannonbury clergyman. Cannonbury clergyman says that catastrophe is inevitable. Doom of London pronounced by Cannonbury clergyman. Cannonbury clergyman's forecast. London a carnival of flood, fire, and earthquake. You can imagine the kind of thing. And so, Secretan Jones, although his main interests were liturgical, was able to secure a few newspaper paragraphs when he suddenly disappeared, rather more than a year after his great campaign in the press had begun, which was not quite forgotten, but nor was it very clearly remembered. A few paragraphs, as I said, were written about him and stowed away, most of them in an out-of-the-way corner of the newspaper. It seemed that Mrs. Sedger, the woman who shared with her husband the business of looking after Secretan Jones, brought in tea on a tray to his study at 4 o'clock one day as usual, and as usual she came to take it away again at 5, when, a good deal to her astonishment, she found the study empty. She concluded that her master must have gone for a stroll, although he never usually strolled at that time. But he didn't come back for dinner. And Mr. Sedger, inspecting the hall that evening, pointed out that his hats and coats and sticks and umbrellas all remained on their pegs and in their places. The Sedgers conjectured this, that, and the other, waited a week, and then went to the police. Now, when the story came out, it perturbed a few learned friends and correspondents. Prebendary Lincoln, author of the Roman canon in the 3rd century, Dr. Brightwell, Wise on the right of Malabar, and Stokes, the Mozarabic man. But you see, the rest of the population didn't take very much notice at all. And when, at the end of 6 weeks, there was a line or two stating that the Reverend Secretan Jones, whose disappearance at the beginning of last month from his house in Tollet Square, Cannonbury, caused some anxiety to his friends, returned yesterday, upon which report there was neither enthusiasm nor curiosity. The last line of the paragraph said that the incident was supposed to have been the result of a misunderstanding, and nobody even asked what that statement meant. And that would very likely have been the end of the whole matter, had not Mr. Sedger gossiped in the circle of the private bar, the King of Prussia, and had not some mysterious and unofficial person in touch with that circle insinuated himself into the presence of my news editor and told him Sedger's tale. Mrs. Sedger, a careful woman, had, it seemed, kept all the rooms tidy and well dusted during her employer's absence. And then one Tuesday afternoon, she had opened the study door and seen, to her amazement and delight, her master sitting at his table with a great book open beside him and a pencil in his hand. "Oh, am I glad to see you back again, sir?" she exclaimed. "Back again?" said the clergyman. "Whatever do you mean, Mrs. Sedger? I think I should like some tea." "Now, I don't know what in the least it's about," said the news editor to me, "but you might go and see Secretan Jones and have a chat with him. You know, there might be a story in it." Well, he was right. There was a story in it, but not one for my paper. And not, in fact, I think, for any paper. I got to the house in Tollet Square and entered on some unhandsome pretext connected with Secretan Jones's traffic scare of the year before. He looked at me in a dim, abstracted way at first, but my mention of the proposed design for a mammoth carrier clarified him, and he began to talk eagerly, and it seemed to me lucidly, about the grave menace of the new mechanical transport. "But what's the point in talking about it?" he ended. "I try to wake people up to the dangers ahead. It seemed to succeed for a few weeks, and then they forgot all about it. You'd really say that the great majority of people are like dreamers, like sleepwalkers. They are. They're like men walking in a dream, shutting out all the actualities, all the facts of life. I mean, they know perfectly well that they're walking on the edge of a precipice. And yet they're well able to believe, it seems, that the precipice is a garden path. So they behave as if it were a garden path, as safe as the path that you see down there going to the door at the bottom of my garden. The study was at the back of the house and looked onto this long garden, which was heavily overgrown with shrubs. Above these, taller elms and planes and ash trees grew, unlocked and handsomely neglected. And under this deep concealment of green boughs, the path went down to a green door, which was just visible under a cloud of white roses. "Safe as the path that you see there," Secretan Jones repeated. And looking at him, I thought that his expression changed a little to a certain questioning, one might say a meditative doubt. He suggested to me a man engaged in an argument who puts his case decisively and then hesitates for the fraction of a second as a point occurs to him of which he'd never thought before, a point as yet unweighed, unestimated, dimly present, but more as a shadow than a shape. Now, the newspaper reporter needs the gestures of the serpent as well as its wisdom. I forget how I glided from the safe topic of the traffic peril to the dubious territory which I'd been sent to explore. At all events, my contortions were the most graceful that I could devise, and they were altogether in vain. Secretan Jones's kind, lean face took on an expression of distress. He looked at me as one in perplexity. He seemed to search his mind, and not for the answer that he should give me, but rather for some answer due to himself. I'm extremely sorry, but I cannot give you the information that you want," he said after a considerable pause. "But I really can't go any further into the matter. In fact, it is quite out of the question to do so. No, I'm sorry, You must tell your editor, or is it sub-editor? Anyway, you must tell him that the whole business is due to a misunderstanding, a misconception, which I'm not at liberty to explain. But I'm very, very sorry that you have come all this way for nothing. And there was real apology and regret, not only in his words, but in his tone and aspect. But you see, I couldn't simply clutch my hat and get on my way. And so we fell into general talk. And it came out that we both came from the Welsh borderland and had long ago walked over the same hills and drunk of the same wells. Indeed, I think that we proved cousinship in the seventh degree or so, and tea came in, and before long, Secretary Jones was deep in liturgical problems, of which I knew just enough to play the listener's part. In fact, when I told him that the hewel, or the chanted eloquence of the Welsh Methodists was in fact the preface tone of the Roman Missal, he overflowed with grateful interest, and he made a note in one of his notebooks and said that the point was most curious and important to him. It was a pleasant evening in the end, and we strolled through the French windows into the green-shadowed blossoming garden, and we went on with our talk till it was time for me to go. I'd taken up my hat as we left the study, and as we stood by the green door in the wall at the end of the garden, I suggested that I might use it. "Oh, I'm sorry, no," said Secretary Jones, looking, I thought, a little worried. "No, I'm afraid it's jammed, or something of that kind. It's always been an awkward door, and I hardly ever use it myself." So we went through the house, and on the doorstep he pressed me to come again, and so cordial was he that I agreed to his suggestion of the Saturday Sennight. And then, at last, I got an answer to the question which my newspaper had originally entrusted to me. But it was an answer that no newspaper could possibly use. The tale, or the experience, or the impression, or whatever it may be called, was delivered to me by very slow degrees, with many hesitations, and in a manner of tentative suggestion that often reminded me of our first talk together. It was as if Jones were again and again questioning himself as to the matter of his utterances, as if he doubted whether they should not rather be treated as dreams and dismissed as trifles. Well, once he said to me, "People do tell their dreams, don't they? But isn't it usually felt that they're telling nothing? So that's what I'm afraid of." Well, I told him that I thought that we might throw a great deal of light on very dark places, more if more dreams were told. But there, I said, is the difficulty. I doubt whether the dreams that I'm thinking of can be told, you see. There are dreams that are perfectly lucid from beginning to end, and also perfectly insignificant. And then there are the dreams which are prophetic. There seems on the whole little doubt of that. And then, of course, you have the sheer clotted nonsense. I once chased Julius Caesar all over London to get his recipe for curried eggs. But besides these, you see, there's a certain dream of another order, I think. Utter lucidity up to the point of waking, and then perceived to be quite beyond the power of words to express. It's neither sense nor nonsense. It has perhaps a notation all of its own, but you can't play Euclid on the violin. Secretary Jones shook his head. "Yes, I'm afraid my experiences are rather like that," he said. It was clear indeed that he found great difficulty in finding a verbal formula which should convey some hint of his adventures. But that was later. To start with, things were fairly easy, although characteristically enough, he began his story before I realized that the story was begun. I'd been talking of the queer tricks that a man's memory can play with him. I was saying that a few days before, I was suddenly interrupted in some work that I was doing, and it was necessary that I should clear my desk in a hurry. I shuffled a lot of loose papers together and put them away, and awaited my caller with a fresh writing pad in front of me. The man came, I attended to the business with which he was concerned, and I went back to my former affairs when he'd gone. But I couldn't find the sheet of papers. You see, I thought that I'd put them in a drawer, but they weren't in the drawer. They were not in any drawer, or in the blotting book, or in any place where one might reasonably expect to find one's papers. They were found the next morning by the servant who dusted the room, stuffed hard down into the crevice between the seat and the back of an armchair and carefully hidden under a cushion. And I told Secretary Jones I had not the faintest recollection of putting them there. You know, my mind was utterly blank on the matter. Yes, said Secretary Jones. Yes, I suppose we all suffer from that sort of thing at times. About a year ago, I had an odd experience of a similar kind, and it troubled me a good deal at the time. It was soon after I'd taken up the question of the new traffic. As you may have gathered, I have been rather absorbed for most of my life in my own special studies, which are rather remote from the activities and interests of the day. It's never been my way to write to the papers to say there are too many dogs in London or to complain about street musicians, but I must say that the extraordinary dangers of using our present road system for a traffic for which it was not designed did impress themselves very deeply upon me, and I dare say I allowed myself to become overexcited. There's a great deal to be said, I think, for the apostolic maxim, study to be quiet and to mind your own business. But I'm afraid I got the whole thing on my brain, rather, and instead of attending to my proper work, I allowed myself to be drawn into the discussion that I'd started, so that for a week or two I thought about very little else. Even when I was looking up authorities in the British Museum, I couldn't get the rumble of the motor van out of my head. I allowed myself, to get harried and worried and distracted, and I put down what followed to all the bother and excitement that I'd let myself in for. I mean, the other day when you had to leave your work in the middle of it and start on something else, I dare say that you felt annoyed or put out, yeah, and that you shoved those papers away without really thinking what you were doing. And I suppose that something of the same kind must have happened to me, but well, it was queer, I think. He paused and seemed to meditate doubtfully, and then he broke out with an apologetic laugh. Oh, it sounds quite crazy, I know, but well, I forgot where I lived. Well, loss of memory through overwork and nervous excitement, I suggested. Well, yes, perhaps, but not quite in the usual way. I was quite clear in my mind about my name and my identity, and I knew my address perfectly well, 39 Tollet Square, Cannonbury. But sorry, you said that you forgot where you lived. I know, but you see, that's where the difficulty of expression that we were talking about the other day comes in. I'm looking for the notation, as you called it. But anyway, it was like this. I've been working till the morning in the reading room with the motor danger, always lurking at the back of my mind. And as I left the museum, feeling a sort of heaviness and confusion, I made up my mind that I would walk home. I thought the air might freshen me up a little. I set out at a good pace. I knew every foot of the way, as I'd often done the walk before, and I went ahead mechanically with my mind wrapped up in a very important matter relating to my proper studies. As a matter of fact, I'd found in a most unexpected quarter a statement that threw an entirely new light on the rite of the Celtic Church, and I felt that I might be on the verge of an important discovery. And I was lost in a maze of conjectures. And when I looked up, I found myself standing on the pavement by the Angel, Islington, totally unaware of where I was supposed to go next. Yes, I did. I recognised the Angel and I saw it, of course, and I knew that I lived in Tollet Square. But you see, the relation between the two had entirely vanished from my consciousness, you see. I mean, for me, there were no longer any points on the compass. There was no such thing as direction, neither north nor south nor left nor right. It was an extraordinary sensation, and I don't feel that I've made it plain to you at all, but I was a good deal disturbed by it, and I felt that I must move somewhere, and so I set off, and I found myself at King's Cross railway station. Well, then I did the only thing that was left to be done. I took a hansom cab and got home, feeling rather shaky. Now, I gathered that this was the first incident of significance in a series of odd experiences that had befallen this learned and amiable clergyman. His memory became thoroughly unreliable, he said, or so he thought at first. He began to miss important papers from his table in the study. A series of notes on 3 sheets lettered A, B, and C were placed by him on the table under a paperweight one night just before he went to bed. They were missing when he went in his study the next morning. And he was certain that he'd put them in that particular place under the bulbous glass weight with the pink roses embedded in it, but they were not there when he looked for them. And then Mrs. Sedger knocked at the door and entered with the papers in her hand. She said that she'd found them between the bed and the mattress in the master's bedroom, and she thought that they might be wanted. Well, Secretary Jones, he could not make it out at all. He supposed that he must have put the papers where they were found and then simply forgotten about it. And he grew very uneasy, afraid that he was on the brink of a nervous breakdown. And then there were difficulties about his books. Now, he'd always been very precise about his books. Each one had its own place. But one morning, when he wanted to consult the Arbuthnot Missal, a big red quarto which lived at the end of a bottom shelf near the window, the Arbuthnot Missal was not there. Now, the poor fellow went up to his bedroom. He felt the bed over, looked under his shirt in the chest of drawers. He searched the entire room absolutely in vain. Determined to get what he wanted, he went to the reading room at the British Museum, verified his reference, and returned to Cannonbury, where the red quarto was in its place on the bookshelf. Now, there it seemed certain there was no room for a loss of memory, and Secretary Jones began to suspect that his servants were playing tricks with him. He tried to find a reason for their imbecility or villainy. He didn't know what to call it, but it would not do at all, he decided. Papers and books disappeared and reappeared, or now and then they vanished without return. One afternoon, struggling, as he told me, against a growing sense of confusion and bewilderment, he had, with considerable difficulty, filled 2 quarto sheets of ruled paper with a number of extracts necessary to the subject that he had in mind. When this was done, he felt this bewilderment thickening like a cloud about him. It was physically and mentally, he said, as if the objects in the room became indistinct. Were presented in a shimmering, a mist or a darkness. He felt afraid and rose, and he went out into the garden, and there were the 2 sheets of paper that he'd left on his table lying on the path by the garden door. I remember he stopped dead as he told me about this. To tell the truth, I was thinking that these instances were rather matter for the ear of a mental specialist than for my hearing. There was enough evidence of a bad nervous breakdown, I thought, and it seemed to me of delusions as well, and I wondered whether it was not my duty to advise the man to go to the best doctor that he knew without delay. But then Secretary Jones began again. I won't tell you any more of these absurdities. I know that they're drivel, pantomime tricks and traps, children's conjuring, contemptible, all of it. But it made me afraid. I felt like a man walking into the dark, beset with uncertain sounds and faint echoes of his own footsteps that seemed to come from a vast depth, until he begins to fear that he's treading by the edge of some awful precipice. One afternoon, I was in a very miserable and distracted state. I couldn't attend to my work at all. So I went out into the garden and I walked up and down, trying to calm myself. I opened the garden door, the one at the end over there, and I looked into the narrow passage which runs at the end of all the gardens on this side of the square. There was nobody there except 3 children playing some game or other. They were queer, stunted little creatures, and I turned back into the garden and I walked into the study. I just sat down and was getting back to my work when Mrs. Sedger came into the room and cried out that she was glad to see me back again. Well, I made up some story. I'm not sure whether she believes it or not. I suppose she thinks that I must have been mixed up in something disreputable. And what had happened? I said. I haven't the remotest notion, he replied. We sat looking at each other for some time. Well, I said eventually, I suppose what had happened was just this. Your nervous system had been in a very bad way for some time, and well, I suppose it simply broke down. You lost your memory, your sense of identity, everything. You may have spent 6 weeks addressing envelopes in the city road. He turned to one of the books on the table at that point and opened it. Between the leaves, there were the dimmed red and white petals of some flower that looked like an anemone. I picked this flower, he said, as I was walking down the path that afternoon. It was the first of its kind to be in bloom very early. It was still in my hand when I walked back into this room, 6 weeks later, as everybody tells me, but it was quite fresh. I had nothing to say. I kept silent for 5 minutes, I suppose, before I asked him whether his mind was an utter blank as to the 6 weeks during which no known person had set eyes on him, whether he had no sort of recollection at all, however vague. At first, nothing at all, he said. I couldn't believe that more than a few seconds came between my opening the garden door and shutting it again. But then in a day or two, there was a vague impression that I had been somewhere where everything was absolutely right. So I can say no more than that. There were no fairy tale joys or bowers of bliss, anything of that kind, and no sense of anything strange or unaccustomed. But, well, there was no care there at all. Est enim magnum chaos. But that means, for there is a great void or a great gulf. Well, we never spoke of the matter again. 2 months later, he told me that his nerves had been troubling him again and that he was going to spend a month or so at a farm near Cannonbury in the Black Mountains, a few miles from his old home. 3 weeks later, I got a letter addressed in Secretary Jones's hand. Inside was a slip of paper on which he'd written those same words. Est enim magnum chaos. The day on which the letter was posted, he had gone out in the wild autumn weather late one afternoon and had never come back. No trace of Secretary Jones has ever been found.